In 1527, an old Spanish ship left Havana looking for water and wood. The crew, hungry and tired, felt happy when they saw an island no one knew about. But ash floated in the wind, and on the beach they found footprints wider than a man's step, and bones broken open where someone had eaten the inside. Something was waiting in the trees, and it had already seen them. So, before we continue, please make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I was 22 when we saw the island. Our guide marked it as an empty space between the paths we knew. The sky was clear and the ocean was calm. We had left Havana with a small load of tools, powder, and a box of beads to trade. Captain Salazar wanted fresh water and wood, and more than that, he wanted a name on a map that others would read. He said the island would give him both. He stood at the back deck with a hand on the rail and watched the shoreline appear like a dark line that grew into trees, rocks, and white waves. Our ship was a tired boat named Santa Marta. The sails had patches. The ropes worked fine if they were wet. The water barrels were low, and the salted pork tasted like tar from the containers. We had been a week on small meals, and I could feel the pain in my arms when I pulled ropes. Ruiz the sailor had a cough that sounded worse at night. Esteban, the guide, kept close watch on the water depth and the color of the sea. He said the bottom rose fast near the island and warned the captain to keep us away until we found a safe path. There were 10 of us on board. I worked as a sailor and whatever else was needed. Hernan led the soldiers. He carried a long spear and kept a gun near him at all times. Friar Martin kept his prayer beads at his belt, and a look that could calm a man who woke from a bad dream. Ibarra the doctor stored plants and knives in a leather roll and hated the smell of the ship more than any man on board. Diego was the youngest, a boy who ran messages and fed the chickens until we ate them. Vasco was our gunner and kept the powder dry as if it were his own soul. Thomas was from the Canary Islands and spoke several languages from the old trade routes. He had an ear for strange words and was good in a boat. We stayed away from the island and watched it through the glass. A reef ran like a long pale scar around the north side. The south side showed a gap where water flowed dark and steady. Smoke lifted from the middle. It did not rise in a thin line like a cooking fire, but in a wide cloud that floated low and slow. The air smelled slightly of fat and salt even from far away. The captain ordered the anchor dropped in 30 fathoms and sent me with Esteban and Ruiz in the longboat to check the path. We pulled hard on the oars as we moved along the reef. The water was clear near the shallow parts and then went dark. A current tried to turn our front. Esteban called out depths as he lowered the weight and drew it up with grains of sand and broken shells stuck to the bottom. We went around a small point and saw a clean path into a bay. The beach was pale sand. A line of palm trees stood back from the water. Behind them, thicker trees rose and hid whatever was inland. No huts showed, no canoes, no people along the shore, only that low smoke farther back. We returned to the Santa Marta and reported. The captain listened and gave orders for a landing at sunrise. He wanted 2 boats with 6 men in each, plus Diego to hold extra shot and powder. We would take tools to cut wood and barrels to fill with fresh water. Vasco loaded 2 small cannons into the boats and covered them with tarps. Hernan picked 4 men who could carry spears without tripping on roots. He gave me a short sword and a small shield and told me to keep them close. We slept in our clothes. The waves lifted the ship in a slow rhythm that my body knew by now. I lay awake and listened to the ship's small sounds, ropes rubbing blocks, a spoon in a cup, the quiet breath of men who had run out of words for the day. I thought of the smoke and the flat line of the beach, and the way birds had turned in a tight circle over the trees and then disappeared all at once. I told myself it was nothing. I did not sleep much. At first light, we lowered the boats. The water lay smooth inside the reef and the shore looked close. We rowed with no talking except for counting. Sand scraped under the bottom, and we ran the boats up the beach. Hernan jumped out first with a spear and held watch while we unloaded barrels and tools. Ibarra and I carried the doctor's roll and a shovel. The air on land was still and heavy. The smell of fat was stronger. It did not come from the boats or the men. We walked the line of palms and looked for a stream. The sand gave way to dirt marked with fallen leaves. Our boots sank slightly and left clear prints. We found tracks that were not ours. At first I took them for the prints of a large man who went barefoot. Then I saw the spacing. 1 step to the next was longer than I could make if I ran. The heel dug deep from heavy weight. The toes spread wide and pressed into the ground like wide paddles. Ruiz knelt over one and set his palm inside. His fingers did not touch both edges. "Some animal," he said without force. Thomas shook his head. "No claw," he said. "4 toes only, human," Hernan said to keep moving. He did not look at the track again. We found water an hour later. A stream ran down from the higher land and cut a narrow path to the sea. The water tasted clean. We heard nothing but the flow and the sound of bugs. We set men to fill the barrels. Ruiz and Vasco cut a straight tree for a new pole and trimmed the branches in a neat pile. The friar walked the bank and looked at the plants. He said they were ones he had seen on other islands, though thicker and taller here. I asked why the birds were silent. He had no answer. We followed the stream a little way inland to see if the flow stayed steady. On a bend we found a pile of bones. They were not buried. They were stacked. The pile held long bones, ribs, and skulls. The skulls were split down the center. The long bones were cracked open. The splits looked fresh. Grease from the inside stained the dirt. A smell of smoke hung in the place, though no fire burned there now. Ibarra crouched over a leg bone and spoke in a low voice. "These are human," he said. "Men and women. The skulls are small and large both. The cuts are made with stone or dull iron, not clean, but they knew where to strike." The friar crossed himself and then steadied his hand. Hernan looked at the trees and at the open ground and said to return to the boats. The captain needed to see this. No one argued. We backed away and kept our eyes on the brush. On the beach, we found our landing changed. Something had moved through the camp we had made. The barrels were still there, and the cannons lay covered, untouched. But a bundle of oars was scattered and one was snapped across a rock. A palm leaf shelter that Diego had set over the powder boxes was crushed flat. The sand was printed with tracks like the ones we had seen by the stream. They walked from the edge of the trees to the boats, around the barrels, and back to the trees. One print stopped close to the front of our longboat and turned as if the thing had stood to look inside. Vasco lifted the tarp from a cannon and checked the touch hole. He made a small sound when he saw that the firing tool was gone, as if a hand had picked it free. I found it near the fire pit. It lay next to a rope we had cut the day before. The rope had been tied into a knot I did not know. The knot held tight. Hernan called us into a circle. His jaw worked once, and then he spoke in a steady voice. "We do not split," he said. "We keep distance between the trees and us. We move the barrels to the boats and get them on board. The captain will anchor closer and bring men and horses if there is a way through the reef. Until then, no one wanders." "Diego, stay next to Thomas. If anything moves from the brush, shout." We carried until our backs burned. The sun climbed and made the air press against us. The only sound beyond our own work was the small hiss of foam on the sand and the trickle of the stream. When the barrels were on board, we loaded the cut wood. I took the last run with a bundle of poles on my shoulder. At the waterline I stopped. The sand under my feet shook once. It was not the sea. It came from inland. A tree bent and rose again. Another did the same a little farther on. Then the brush settled. We pushed off and rowed hard to the Santa Marta with the first load. On deck, we told the captain what we had seen. He called Esteban to the rail and studied the bay. He spoke without taking his eyes from the shore. "We move in as far as we dare," he said. "We will not leave good water and wood because of tracks. Men make tracks. Men can be dealt with." The anchor came up. We moved into the path with the current, keeping just enough sail to hold our line. The reef showed its teeth on both sides, and the ship shook when the waves lifted. Esteban called out marks. The captain held the steering stick as if he would pull the island toward us by force. We dropped anchor a short distance from the beach. I could see the broken oar from the deck now. The knot in the rope looked like a small fist in the sun. We loaded the second load near noon. The beach looked the same as before. The tracks were fresh again over ours. A new set crossed the stream where we had not crossed. In the soft mud by the bank, we saw the print of a knee and a hand next to it. The hand covered my whole arm from wrist to elbow. Ibarra noted that the skin had left a faint trace of ash in the mud. The friar said to be careful what we touched. He said we walked among things we did not understand. We worked faster. Hernan kept 2 men with spears facing the trees. Vasco prepared a cannon on shore and pointed it toward the brush. He set a length of slow match and told Diego to watch the flame. Ruiz and I dragged a cut log toward the boats. My boots dug into wet sand. The log moved inch by inch. I counted my breaths and put my back into it. The sand shook again. It happened 3 times in a slow count. The birds returned in a wild cloud and then flew away over the water. The brush parted once and closed. I saw nothing clear, only a dark shape, then leaves. We stood in a half circle and raised our weapons. No one spoke. The air smelled of fat again, stronger than before, and something sour that stung the nose. I lifted the log with Ruiz and we made the last steps to the boat. We shoved off without waiting for orders. As the bottom slid, the sand behind us showed new prints. They appeared as the water pulled back and filled as it came back. The stride was long. The weight was great. I felt my hands shake when I set the oars. On the way to the ship, I looked back at the line of trees. For a moment I thought I saw a face in the leaves. Not a mask, not paint, just a pale shape between branches at the height of 2 men. The leaves moved and then stilled. I told no one. I knew what I had seen might be my own fear. I kept rowing and counted strokes and tried to keep my breath even. The island did not feel empty. It felt awake and watching us. I did not like that thought, but it stayed. We ate on deck and kept gear close. The captain ordered 2 more runs at the bay before dark. He set a bell schedule for the night and moved a box of beads and iron nails to the back deck. He wanted to test whether gifts at the tree line would bring anyone out. Hernand asked for permission to place a mark on the beach that warned others away. The captain allowed it. He liked the show of strength. On the 3rd trip to shore, we found a structure we had not noticed. It stood beyond the palms in a patch of hard ground, half hidden by vines. It was a frame of thick wood tied with rope, taller than a man by a head. Skulls hung from the cross pieces by cords. They had been scraped clean. In the center, a pole carried a belt of ribs and a length of braided hair. A round stone lay beneath as if used for breaking bone. The cords were worn smooth by handling. Flies gathered at the base where grease clotted the dirt. Thomas crouched to study the knots. "This knot is from no place I know," he said. "It locks when pulled and leaves a small loop. Whoever tied it has long practice." We stood back from the frame. The air was still. Ibarra spoke half to himself. "These are prizes," he said. "The frame is a marker, not a grave." Hernand spat in the dirt and set his boot on the stone. "Let them see we are not frightened," he said, and flipped a skull from its cord with the tip of his spear. It rolled once and settled. The friar told him to stop. Hernand turned away with a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. We returned to the beach with the last of the wood, and a net full of shellfish gathered at the rocks near the stream. The sand near the boats held a new sign. A fish the length of a man lay opened with its insides removed cleanly. The head had been twisted off and set beside the body. A small branch of leaves rested on the side. The skin showed cuts made in a pattern that ran from tail to belly. Our knives could not make such clean lines on that tough skin. The branch had a smell that made my tongue feel numb. "An offering," Tomas said. "Or a warning," Vasco said. We pushed off without debate and climbed aboard the Santa Marta before the light fell. The captain set both boats pulling behind and aimed a small cannon toward the path. He ordered a slow sweep along the shore to test the wind in the bay, and then brought us back to the anchor. As the sun went low, he told Hernand to take 4 men and plant a pole with a board that marked our claim and passage. Hernand chose me, Ruiz, Diego, and Thomas. We loaded the board: a hammer, nails, a small barrel of powder, and the box of beads. On the beach, Hernand set the board at the high water line. He carved a cross above the letters and hammered the nails with firm strokes. Thomas placed beads at the base in a careful ring. The barrel of powder went next to the beads with a string tied to the plug, leading back under the sand to where Ruiz held the end. If the line moved, he would pull the plug and let the powder spill to wet sand. Hernand thought it a good trick. He smiled once at the neatness of it. We stepped back to the longboat and waited with oars ready. The trees were a wall of shadow. The frame with skulls stood darker than the trunks. No sound came but the wash on the sand. Diego kept looking at the line in the sand where the string ran. He held his breath as if the powder might hear him. I watched the edge of the trees and counted to 50 and back. Something moved at the frame. A shape larger than a man stood just behind it. The skulls shifted once as if a hand had brushed them. The shape leaned out and then back. I felt sweat on my palm and shifted my grip on the oar. Thomas raised a hand to still us. He lifted the box of beads and set it on the sand halfway between us and the tree line. He stepped back, palms open. "We come to trade," he said in clear, slow words, one after another. using greeting words from islands he knew. He repeated them and then fell silent. The shape did not move forward. A low sound came from the trees. Not a word, not a growl. Something that carried through the leaves and seemed to ask what we were. Another sound answered it from farther left. Diego whispered, "There is more than one." Ruiz set his hand on Diego's shoulder and pressed down. "Hold," he said. A long arm reached from behind the frame. The skin was pale and had streaks of ash. The hand closed over the top of the frame and lifted it as if it were no heavier than a chair. The shape moved with the frame in one motion and set it aside. The skulls clicked against each other. Then the shape came out. The man was taller than any I had seen, with wide shoulders and a big chest. The hair on his head hung in a twisted rope. Scar lines crossed his arms. His lower jaw seemed larger than his forehead, and his teeth showed when he breathed through his mouth. He wore a skirt of woven fiber and a belt strung with small bones. His arms were wrapped with strips of hide. In his right hand, he held a club made from a root with knots like stones. He looked at us without any rush. Another stepped beside him. This one carried a spear of black wood tipped with sharpened bone. A third stood behind, a head taller still with a belly that pushed against his belt. The third sniffed the air and then looked at the beads. He bent down with the stiffness of a man used to his own weight. He picked up a bead and rolled it between thumb and finger. He put it in his mouth and bit. He spat it out and wiped his lip. He spoke a short word to the first. The first nodded once. Thomas tried again. He named objects and touched them. He said, water, food, iron, wood, cloth, in different languages. The first giant listened without moving. Then he pointed at the powder barrel. He tapped his chest and then pointed at the trees. He made a scooping motion as if taking something that should be his. Hernan shook his head and drew a line across his chest with his hand. He pointed at the board with the cross and at the ship. The first giant watched the movement and then looked back at the barrel. He stepped forward once. Ruiz pulled the string. The plug came free and powder spilled. The first giant stopped short and tilted his head. He bent down and dipped a finger in the powder and brought it to his tongue. He spat and made a face. The second giant laughed, a low, short sound. The third sniffed again and stretched his arms like a man waking. Hernand raised his spear and spoke in a sharp tone. "Back," he said. He kept his eyes on the club. The first giant looked at the bead box and then at the longboat. He stepped sideways, not closer, not farther, just changing his angle. The second shifted to match. The third stood still. I felt the breath leave my chest in a slow stream. I thought of the frame and the skulls and the pattern cut into the fish. I also thought of the water we needed and the wood we had. I did not want to shoot or run. The sky had gone the color that comes before night. The ship's lanterns were not yet lit. The air had no wind to carry a shout. Tomas took a strip of iron nails from his bag and held them high. He set them on the sand and stepped back again. The first giant's eyes went to the metal. He moved with more purpose now. He walked to the nails and knelt. He sniffed, touched, and then lifted them. He held them to his belt as if measuring where they would go. He stood to full height and looked at Thomas. "Friend," Thomas said, tapping his chest. "Friend?" He pointed to himself, then to the giant, then to the ship, then to the stream. He made a lifting motion with both hands as if to show a shared task. The giant did not echo the word. He touched his chest with 3 heavy taps and spoke a name that sounded like a stone on wood. He pointed at the second and the third and spoke 2 more names that had the same weight. Then he pointed to the forest and said a longer word that sounded like a place. He turned and gave the club to the second. He held the nails against his belt and walked backward 2 steps, then turned and went into the trees without hurry. The second and third followed after a pause. The frame remained on the ground. The beads lay scattered by their feet. The powder barrel leaked a dark spot into the sand. We waited until the brush closed behind them. Hernan did not lower his spear until the last leaf stopped moving. He spoke in a low voice. "Back to the ship," he said. "No prizes. Leave the box." We told the captain what had passed. He listened without moving and then called for lanterns on both sides and the back. He ordered the slow match lit at both small cannons and had a bow strung with arrows ready near the rail. Vasco set a double charge in one cannon and checked the opening 3 times. The captain told Esteban to note the time and the tide. He wanted to know how the current shifted at dark in the path. He had us run extra lines to the anchor to steady the front, Night on the bay was thick. The island did not show a single light inland. No fires burned on the beach. The water lay flat except for small ripples where fish moved. We ate in turns, and the captain walked the deck and stopped often to listen. The friar spoke softly with Diego and gave him a small wooden cross that he had carved on other trips for boys who had not seen home in a while. Diego closed his hand over it and nodded. Near midnight, a sound came from the reef, stones knocking. Then a splash like a body dropping from a height. The ship shook, not from a wave, from a touch. Vasco ran to the side with the lantern. A dark shape slid along the boards and disappeared behind. Another hit the rudder and the steering stick jumped in its place. Esteban swore under his breath and threw his weight on it. We heard breathing close to the waterline, not through the nose, through the mouth, slow and steady. A hand rose on the right side, fingers spread, and tested the ship as if it were a tree. "Stand ready," the captain said. "Do not fire unless I say." A head rose briefly into the light. Wet hair stuck to a wide forehead. Eyes reflected the lantern glow without color. The head sank back with no splash. Then a rope went loose and tugged. A tie rope at the front dipped toward the water as if something pulled it hand over hand. The knot jerked and held. The pull stopped and then started again. The line creaked. "Cut it," Hernan said. "Wait," the captain said. The pull stopped again. A low voice spoke from the water in the same word we had heard earlier. Another answered from the other side. The sound was not angry. It was plain, like a man who asked for a tool. They let go. The line lifted free of strain. The breathing faded. We waited with weapons ready. After a long time, Esteban eased the steering stick to center again. The captain told us to keep lanterns high and change the watch every hour with 2 men on each side and 1 at the back. Before dawn, the smell reached us. It blew from land when the air shifted. It came like a cloth waved in front of the face. Burned fat, cooked meat, a sweetness under it that turned the stomach. We stood downwind and said nothing. I thought of the bones by the stream and of the heads on cords, and I knew what the smell meant without needing Ibarra's words. Then a second smell came, a burned scent like tree sap. Vasco lifted his head. "Tar," he said. "They are sealing something." At first light, the beach showed new marks. Our board with the cross had been moved. It now leaned against the powder barrel. The box of beads was open and empty. In its place sat the frame of skulls set between the board and the barrel, as if the 3 were now one sign. A long pole had been planted beside them. At its top hung a fresh scalp with hair dark and long. The hair was matted with oil. The scalp was not from one of us. It was too long for any of our men. The captain looked through the glass and then handed it to me. The pole and the frame stood still. No people showed in the tree line. The stream ran as before. The sand around the pole was stamped with new prints overlapping like a maze. "We will not be toyed with," the captain said. He turned to Hernan. "We go inland today. We find their camp. We show them we are not prey." Thomas asked to try one more exchange first. "They came to the line," he said. "They took nails. They did not break the boats. We can give them iron for wood and water. We can leave without spilling blood." Hernan shook his head. "They tasted the ship," he said. "They tested our ropes. Next, they test our throats." The friar looked at the beach and then at the men. "If we go inland, we go with care," he said. "We take what we need for one day and do not chase shadows. We hold a clear line back to the boats." The captain nodded once. 14 men on shore," he said. 2 cannons, powder for the match, water bags, food for the day. We cut trail marks every 20 steps. Esteban keeps the ship ready to pull anchor if the wind turns. I checked my sword edge and found a nick that I filed smooth with a small stone. I ate a heel of bread and drank a cup of water and felt it sit heavy. I told myself to keep my steps light and my eyes open. We lowered the boats again. The men climbed in with gear balanced across their knees. The morning sun gave little warmth. The island waited without sound. I did not like that silence. I reminded myself that I had felt the same once on a different shore and had walked away again. It helped a little. We ran the boats up the sand and set the cannons on their low stands. Vasco chose a spot with a clear shot into the gap between 2 large trees. He prepared both and laid slow match. Hernan placed men in a line with spears forward, guns in the second row, and swords behind. He told me to keep to the right of the line as scout and to mark the bark at eye level with my knife. Thomas would listen and watch for any sign of language or signal. Ibarra would take anything useful he found for understanding what we faced. The friar would keep eyes on the men's heads and not on the trees. We passed the frame and the pole without touching them. The scalp hung still. Flies moved on it in a quick group. We entered the trees and the light changed. The trunks rose straight and high and vines hung in curtains. The ground was uneven with roots and old stumps. The air had a wet weight. We moved in a measured rhythm. Every few steps, I nicked the bark with the same small cut so we could see our way back. 10 minutes in, we found a path beaten into the plants. It was not a deer track. The width fit 4 men side by side. At the edges, broken twigs showed where something large brushed by often. The path carried a faint sour smell. We moved onto it with the spears tight to the front. I heard a thud to our left, then quiet. Another sounded to the right, farther off. Hernan raised a hand and we stopped. He pointed with 2 fingers and the gunmen lifted their guns to that side. We waited and heard nothing else. The path climbed and then leveled. We came to a clearing. In it stood 3 racks woven from heavy branches and set low to the ground. On the racks lay cuts of meat drying over small smoky fires covered with damp leaves. At the far side of the clearing, a pit had been dug and lined with stones. Heat rose from it. A round rock with a dark stain sat near the pit, larger than the one by the frame. On a line strung between 2 posts hung lengths of muscle cord and strips of skin. A jawbone with teeth still in it had been tied to the post as if to keep it from curling as it dried. No one spoke. I felt my mouth go dry. Diego stared and gripped his knife until his knuckles went white. Vasco stepped to the pit and held his hand over it. "They roasted a body here not long ago," he said. "The stones still hold heat." Ibarra knelt by the racks and studied the cuts without touching them. He spoke in a flat voice. "Human thigh, shoulder, rib meat. They take the fat and the muscles. They know how to dry it." Tomas walked to the edge of the clearing and pointed at a set of footprints. "A child," he said. "Small steps, bare feet. They are not only men here." A sound came from the other side of the clearing. A branch bent and rose. The men lifted weapons without orders. Hernan's voice carried low and hard. "Form," he said. "No one runs. If they charge, spears first. Guns fire on my mark. Aim at legs." I swallowed and rolled my shoulders once to ease the tightness. I told myself to watch for the first shift in the leaves. I wanted to see it a heartbeat before the others. I wanted to be useful. The brush ahead of us moved again. Not wide, just a steady parting as if a heavy body slid through with patience. A shadow filled the gap. Then a face showed, different from the one on the beach. This one had scars that ran from ear to jaw on a ladder. The eyes had a dead calm. He took 1 step into the clearing and stopped. He looked at our line and then at the racks. He made a short sound behind him. More shapes gathered in the leaves. The man with the scarred face stood still, his weight even on both legs, his chest wide and bare. Behind him, 5 more figures stepped from the brush one at a time. They carried clubs, spears, and one carried a bow strung with gut and a bundle of arrows tied with grass. Their height made our spears look short. The smell of smoke and grease hung on their skin. One had a necklace of finger bones that clicked when he moved. Another had a strip of cloth torn and stained tied around his head like a band. They did not rush. They spread out along the edge of the clearing, silent, but for the slow crack of branches under their feet. The scarred one lifted a hand. The others held their places. He pointed with 2 fingers at the racks and then at us. His voice was deep and carried without force. He said a word once, then again. Thomas strained to catch it, mouthing the sound. He said it under his breath. "He says eat or food." He points at us. He points at meat. Hernan raised his spear and spoke back in Spanish. "We are not meat," he said. "We are not yours." His tone was iron, but his jaw worked. The scarred one looked at the racks again and then made the same motion toward us. He tapped his own belly and grinned, teeth long and wide. He said the word a 3rd time, louder. Behind him, one of the giants chuckled and spat to the side. The bowman put an arrow on the string and let it hang. The others shifted their weight. The ground under us felt narrow. My hand ached around the sword grip. Vasco whispered through his teeth. "If they close, shoot. The ball will break bone at this distance." Hernan's voice came steady. "Not yet." He moved his spear to the line of the scarred one's chest. "Hold until they break the distance." The friar stepped forward half a step, his hand raised. He spoke in calm Latin, the blessing for peace and for protection. The words rolled low and even, not fast, not weak. The giants watched him. The scarred one tilted his head as if listening to a story he had not heard before. For a moment the others did not move. Then one with the necklace of finger bones leaned forward and spoke a long string of words. He slapped his stomach and barked a laugh. He pointed his club at Diego, who had gone pale and stiff as a board. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. The air pressed heavy on my chest. I wanted to strike or run, but my legs held where they were. I thought of the ship waiting in the bay. The lanterns lit, the sails folded. The way back was a line through trees that could close at any step. We could not stand here forever. Tomas took a slow step forward. He held out an iron knife flat on his palm. He said the word he thought meant food, then added water, iron, friend, all in different languages he had used before. He pointed at the knife, then at the racks, then back to us. His voice shook once and steadied. "Trade," he said. "Trade." The scarred one looked at the knife. His eyes narrowed. He said something to the bowman, who lowered the arrow and let the string loosen. The scarred one stepped forward 2 steps, close enough that I could see the seams of scars under his ribs. He held out his hand. His fingers were thick as branches, nails cracked. Thomas laid the knife across his palm. The giant closed his hand around it and tested the edge against his thumb. Blood came up where it touched. He looked at the drop without blinking, then licked it. His tongue came away red. He spoke a short command. The others shifted back a step. He turned the knife in his hand and then pointed with it toward the path behind us, the one we had cut in from the beach. He said a word that sounded like, "Go." He repeated it with more force, pointing again. Then he lifted the knife as if to show he kept it. His grin widened. He tapped the blade to his chest, then pointed at us, then again at the path. "Go." Hernan's jaw clenched. "He sends us out," he said. His knuckles whitened on the spear, but he lowered it slowly, the tip dipping until it touched ground. He spat once to the side, never taking his eyes from the scarred one. "We take the order this time." We backed toward the path. The giants did not follow, though their eyes never left us. The bowman stayed with the arrow ready but low. The scarred one watched every step. When the last of us reached the path, he raised the knife high and barked a single word. The others answered with deep voices all at once, like a wall of sound. It carried into the trees and bounced back at us. My chest shook with it. Then they fell silent again. We moved fast along the path we had marked. My knife cuts shone pale in the dim light, easy to follow. I kept glancing behind. The brush closed behind us, empty, no sound but our boots and our breaths. When we reached the beach, the cannons stood where we had left them, untouched. The pole with the scalp still leaned near the board. The flies had thickened. The boats looked smaller than I remembered. We pulled them into the water without pause. On the ship, the captain heard our words and stood still for a long time. Then he said, "They own the island. We cannot break them with the men we have. We have water. We have wood. We will not stay for glory. We mark it as cursed ground and leave." His tone left no space for reply. That night, we lay at anchor one last time. No shapes moved in the water. No ropes pulled, but in the distance inland, we saw a glow against the sky. A fire burned high. The smell of fat carried again across the water. Men shifted in their sleep and turned on their blankets. I lay awake and listened to the faint sound of voices from shore, deep and steady, like men singing to keep rhythm. The sound carried far. It did not break until dawn. We raised anchor with the first light and let the tide carry us through the path. The reef broke white on both sides. The island slipped behind. I watched until the line of trees blurred into sky. My arms ached with the pull of ropes, but I kept looking back. I thought of the knife in the scarred one's hand. The way he held it as if it belonged to him from the start. I thought of the racks, the pits, the skulls on cords. I knew I would never set foot on that shore again. But I also knew others would.